The wall is warm. The sun went down more than an hour ago, and the stone is still giving back the heat it took in all afternoon. And the stone is black, not gray, not the pale gold you have seen in every painting of this place. Black, the dark volcanic rock of the northern Galilee, gathered out of the fields, barely shaped, stacked and bedded in mud that dried a shade lighter than the stone itself. You are standing in a doorway low enough that you had to stoop to get through it, in a fishing village on the northwestern shore of the Sea of Galilee, somewhere around the year 29. The village is called Capernaum. This is what Peter's house looked like. Now here is the reason we can stand here at all. Every room in this village is bare rock on the inside. Nobody finishes a wall here, except that somebody, in the 1st century, took one ordinary room in this block and covered it in smooth, pale plaster, and then stopped cooking in it. Both of those things are in the ground. Both of them can be demonstrated. 3 centuries later, a church was built around that room. 2 centuries after that, a second church was raised on top of it. And today there is a modern building standing on pillars above the whole thing, with a floor made of glass, so that people can stand in mid-air and look straight down at it. One small dark room, and everything since has been arranged around it. The rooms in front of you belong to a fisherman named Simon, and to his brother Andrew. Mark 1:29 calls it the house of Simon and Andrew. And the man who has been living here for something like the past year, sleeping under this roof, eating in this courtyard, teaching in the room at your shoulder, came down from Nazareth and did not go back. Matthew 4:13 says he left Nazareth and settled in Capernaum by the sea. A few chapters later, Matthew 9:1 calls Capernaum simply his own city. So let us walk through it. And let me say now, before we start, that we cannot prove this house was Peter's. I will show you exactly what we can prove and exactly where that line falls when we reach it. Start with the thing that will disorient you most, because everything else follows from it. The inside was dark. Capernaum was built out of basalt, and ordinary houses were not finished on the inside. The stone was left exposed. Rough field stone, largely unworked, with smaller chips wedged into the joints to hold the courses steady. No plaster in an ordinary room, no whitewash, nothing pale to throw light around. The windows are few, they are small. They are set high in the wall for security and for shade, and there is no glass in them. Put those 3 facts together: black walls, high small windows, no glazing, and you get a practical result that changes every scene you think you know. In a room like this, you could not read at noon without a lamp, which is why the Gospels keep reaching for lamps. When Jesus says in Matthew 5:15 that no one lights a lamp and puts it under a basket, but on a stand where it gives light to everyone in the house, that sentence only works in a single room with one flame in it. When the woman in Luke 15:8 loses a coin and has to light a lamp and sweep the floor to find it, she is not being careless. She is looking for a small, bright thing on beaten earth, in the dark, at whatever hour of the day it happens to be. Notice what this does to a phrase you have heard 100 times. Isaiah, 7 centuries earlier, wrote about the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, and said the people dwelling in darkness have seen a great light. Matthew quotes it, Matthew 4:15 and 16, and attaches it deliberately to the moment Jesus changes address. The prophecy is fastened to a postal code, and the postal code is a village made of black rock, where you needed a flame to see your own floor. Now look at the construction, because there is one structural fact here that the entire story turns on. These walls are rough, and they are thick at the base relative to their height. But thickness is not the point. Quality is. This masonry is fieldstone and mud. It is not dressed, it is not coursed with precision, and it cannot carry a stone vault or a masonry upper story. There is no second floor here. There cannot be. And that means the roof had to be light. So here is how it was made. Wooden beams laid across the shorter span of the room. Branches, reeds, and thorn brush laid across the beams. Then packed earth mixed with straw, trodden down flat on top of the whole thing. A stone roller was kept up there and run across the surface after every rain to press the mud back together and seal the cracks. In spring, grass grew on it. The psalmist knew exactly this roof. Psalm 129:6 speaks of grass on the housetops, which withers before it grows up. The roof was not waste space. It was the coolest place in the compound on a summer night, and the most private place in it at any hour. And you reached it by an outside stair or a ladder, because there is no interior staircase in a house with no interior corridor. Torah takes the use of that roof entirely for granted. Deuteronomy 22:8 requires that when you build a new house, you make a parapet for your roof, so that you do not bring guilt of blood on your house if someone falls from it. That is a law written for a culture where people are routinely up there. Peter himself is up on a roof at noon to pray in Acts 10:9. That scene is in Joppa, at the house of Simon the tanner, not in Capernaum, and it should not be moved here. But it tells you how this particular man used a rooftop, and that is worth something. Hold on to the roof. We are coming back to it, and when we do, you will understand something about one of the most famous scenes in the Gospels that almost nobody notices. Step through the doorway. The first thing that is missing is the furniture. There is no table, there are no chairs. Every image you carry of this room has put a table in the middle of it, and the table is not there. People sat on the floor, on mats and cushions, or on a low bench built against the wall. They ate that way, slept that way, and taught that way. When Mark 9:33 has Jesus in the house asking the disciples what they had been arguing about on the road, and then, in the next verses, sitting down, calling the 12 and taking a child into his arms. The sitting down is a physical act at floor level, and the child is at eye height because everyone is already low. The bedding is rolled and stowed by day. The mat the paralyzed man is carried in on, in Mark 2, is called a krabatos in the Greek, a poor man's pallet, not a bed frame. That is why he can pick it up and walk out with it under his arm at the end. Against the wall, storage jars, grain, oil, salted fish, water. In the courtyard, not in the room, the cooking pots, because the fire is outside. On the floor near the door, in a niche cut or built into the wall, the lamp, the small wheel-made type with the nozzle paired flat with a knife. The standard lamp of 1st century Judea and Galilee, small enough to sit in your palm, burning olive oil through a fiber wick with a flame about the size of your thumbnail. The light in this room comes from below waist height, and it throws every shadow upward across black stone. And in the courtyard, the basalt hand mill. 2 stones, turned by hand, worked for hours every single morning, because bread was baked daily and grain does not grind itself. Capernaum did not merely use basalt, it cut it and sold it. Unfinished millstones and olive press components have come out of the ground here, which means this village was producing stone equipment for export. That is worth pausing on, because of where Jesus came from. Nazareth is limestone country, pale, soft, chalky hillstone. Capernaum is black volcanic rock. He grew up in one and moved to the other, and the two towns did not look remotely alike. He went from white stone to black. Let me stop here and ask you something directly, because this is the part I cannot answer for you. 16 kilometers down this same shoreline, Herod Antipas had just finished Tiberias, a new capital, a palace, a stadium, the money of a tetrarch. If you were choosing where to base a ministry in Galilee in the year 29, that was the obvious answer. The choice that got made was this instead: an earth floor, one lamp, no furniture, and a ceiling you could put your hand through. So when you look at your own life, at whatever room you are sitting in right now, at the ordinary, unremarkable, unfinished shape of it, what exactly is it that you think disqualifies your house? Tell me in the comments. Not the polished answer, the real one. I read them. Now add the rest of it, because a house is not only its walls. There is no spring inside this village, and there is no aqueduct. Water comes from the lake, roughly 80 to 100 meters away, and the shoreline has moved over 2,000 years, so the ancient walk was probably shorter than the modern one. It comes in jars, carried by hand, every day, without exception, which is exactly the labor that Mark 1:31 sends Simon's mother-in-law straight back into. When Mark says that after the fever left her, she began to serve them, he is not describing a gesture. He is describing the courtyard, the oven, the water, the mill. And while we are standing in that courtyard, here is the silence I find hardest to explain. Simon had a wife. We know it because decades later, Paul defends the right of Cephas to travel with a believing wife in 1 Corinthians 9:5. Her mother is the woman lying feverish in the front room, in 3 separate Gospels, and she herself is never mentioned at Capernaum, not once in any of them. She was almost certainly in this courtyard for every scene we are about to walk through. The text simply does not look at her. There are animals in or beside that courtyard: a donkey, poultry, perhaps a few sheep or goats. Their dung is dried and burned as fuel. There are flies, because this is a town whose economy is gutting and salting fish in the heat. The air holds wood smoke and dung smoke off the ovens, fish both fresh and preserved, burning olive oil, livestock, dust in the dry months, and in winter the smell of wet earth, because the ceiling over your head is made of earth, and when it rains, it smells like it. And the sound, the mill turning before dawn, the lake, men and boats on the shore in the dark, voices from the other rooms across a courtyard that has no doors between households, because there is no privacy here in any sense you would recognize. Several families share this open space. Everyone hears everything. And from about 30 meters away, the synagogue. 30 meters. That is the distance from this doorway to the building where Mark 1:21 says Jesus taught on the Sabbath. When Mark says that immediately after leaving the synagogue, they went into the house of Simon and Andrew, the word immediately is not literary compression. It is a walk of well under a minute. Now let me tell you how we know any of this. In 1894, the Franciscan custody of the Holy Land acquired the western portion of the ruins at Capernaum, and beginning in 1968, 2 excavators, Virgilio Corbo and Stanislao Lofreda, dug beneath the remains of a 5th century octagonal church on that site, expecting more Byzantine building underneath. They did not find Byzantine building. They found a block of small rooms grouped around shared courtyards, standing from the 1st century before Christ and through the 1st century after. An insula, about 30 meters south of the synagogue. And one room in that block was different. Not because of gold, not because of a burial, not because of an inscription naming anyone. It was different for 2 reasons, and both of them are so ordinary that you have to slow down to see why they matter. The first is plaster. What those two men had in front of them, down in that trench, was a smooth, pale surface where there should have been rough, black stone. That room had been plastered, floor, walls, and ceiling, and then replastered repeatedly over time. Nothing comparable turned up anywhere else in that block. In a village where the inside of a house was bare basalt, somebody went to the trouble of covering one room in white and then kept renewing it. The second is pottery, and this is the part that persuaded them. Lafreda tracked what kind of vessels appear in that room across the layers. In the early phase, it is what you would expect from any working household: cooking wares, the everyday ceramics of people making meals. And then, somewhere in the middle to later part of the 1st century, the cooking wares effectively stop. What replaces them is storage jars and lamps. Think about what that means. A room where people stopped cooking and started bringing lamps is a room that stopped being a kitchen and started being a meeting place. That is an argument built entirely out of an absence, out of what is no longer there. And it is far more convincing than a relic would be, precisely because nobody could have planted it. Then the layers keep going. In the 4th century, that single room is enclosed inside a large square precinct wall, a private house converted into a church building. Pilgrims scratched more than 100 inscriptions into the plaster, in Greek, Aramaic, Syriac, Hebrew, and Latin. And several of them invoke Jesus as Lord and as Christ. In the 5th century, an octagonal church was raised directly over it, with the center of the octagon placed deliberately on that same room. And around the years 381 to 384, a pilgrim named Egeria came through Capernaum and reported that the house of the Prince of the Apostles had been made into a church, with its original walls still standing. Worth being precise here, that passage of Egeria's travel account does not survive in her own manuscript. It reaches us through a 12th century compilation by a writer called Peter the Deacon, who quotes her. It is early testimony, and it is valuable, and it is not a 1st century document. So let me be exact about what all of this proves, because this is where a great many videos about this site quietly overreach. It proves that a 1st century basalt house in Capernaum was singled out, plastered, emptied of cooking pots, scratched with prayers in 5 languages by people who had traveled a very long way to reach it, walled off, and finally roofed over by a church built to center on it, an unbroken chain of veneration reaching back to within living memory of the apostles themselves. It does not prove that Simon Peter slept there. You will find it said that Peter's name appears in the graffiti. One scholar, Emmanuel Testa, read it that way. Other epigraphers, including Joan Taylor, have contested that reading. It is not settled, and I am not going to hand it to you as though it were. The identification of this house as Peter's is a tradition, a very early, very well-supported tradition, resting on the convergence of 4 things: the stratigraphy, the 4th century pilgrim testimony, the 30 meters to the synagogue, and the gospel record itself. Convergence is not proof. What we can say with confidence is that somebody, very early indeed, was certain enough about this room to plaster its walls and stop cooking in it. Hold that honest limit in your mind, and now walk back into the room. Because the Gospels put 4 separate scenes inside a Capernaum house, and Mark never once tells us whose. Mark 2:1 says Jesus was at home. Mark 3:20 says he went home, and the crowd gathered again so that they could not even eat. Mark 9:33 says that when he was in the house, he asked them a question. Reading all of these as Simon's house is the standard reading and a reasonable inference. But it is inference, 3 separate times, and Mark himself never spells it out. And there is a fourth, quieter than the others, that almost nobody quotes. Mark 1:35 says that rising very early in the morning, while it was still dark, he departed and went out to a desolate place to pray. Put that sentence back inside the building we have just reconstructed. To leave before dawn, he has to cross a shared courtyard, past the animals, past the water jars, past the doorways of other families sleeping a few meters away, and get out into the lane without waking anyone. In a compound with no interior corridors and no doors between households, that is not a poetic detail. That is a man moving very carefully in the dark. Now take the most famous of them, Mark 2, the paralyzed man. But start the evening before it, because Mark does. Mark 1:32-34 says that at sundown they brought him all who were sick, and the whole city was gathered together at the door. Notice the hour. They waited for sundown, for the end of the Sabbath, when carrying a burden stopped being a violation, and then the village moved. Which means all of this happens in the dark. Stretchers and mats coming up a lane between black walls, lamps carried in hands at waist height, the only light there is. A courtyard filling with people who have been waiting all day for the sun to go down. And a low doorway at the end of it, with one room behind it. The room in question, if it is the venerated room, measures roughly 7 meters by 6.5, about 45 square meters, somewhere near the footprint of a modern one-car garage and a half. Now fill it. Mark says the crowd was such that there was no more room, not even at the door. And Luke 5:17 adds a detail that changes the whole picture. Among that crowd were Pharisees and teachers of the law, who had come from every village of Galilee and Judea and from Jerusalem, and they were sitting. Seated people take up several times the floor space of standing ones. Run the arithmetic, and be honest that the density figure is my assumption rather than a finding. Packed shoulder to shoulder, you might theoretically force well over 100 bodies into 45 square meters. With dignitaries seated on the floor and a doorway people have to pass through, realistically, you are looking at something like 50 to 70 inside, and another few dozen filling the courtyard and the lane. Against a village that Jonathan Reed has estimated at something on the order of 1,000 inhabitants, with Sharon Leah Matila arguing for a larger and less impoverished town, so treat that as a range and not a number. The conclusion is unavoidable. When Mark says the whole city was gathered at the door, most of them never got inside. They stood in a shared courtyard and a lane between black walls after sundown, waiting. And now you know why 4 men went up onto that roof. Not because they were bold, because there was no other way in. They carried a man on a mat up an exterior stair that existed because the roof was living space. They stood on a surface that had a parapet around it, because Torah required one. And then, Mark 2:4 says, they dug through it. The Greek verb means exactly that. They excavated. Beams, brush, packed earth, straw, hands and determination, and no special tools. Here is a detail worth your attention, and it is the reason I trust Mark on this. Luke, telling the same story in Luke 5:19, says they let the man down through the tiles. Tiles. Luke is writing for readers around the Mediterranean who pictured a Greco-Roman roof, and he translates the building into a material they could see. Mark keeps the Galilean version, and the Galilean version is the one that came out of the ground at Capernaum. 2 evangelists, 2 roofing materials, 1 event, and the archaeology quietly settles which of them was describing the actual house. There is one more thing about that scene that the text never resolves. 4 men opened a hole in a working family's roof before the November rains. Nobody in the gospel goes back to it. Nobody says who climbed up with a basket of mud and a stone roller to close it. It is a small silence, and I find I cannot stop noticing it. Now step back and look at what this room actually is in the arc of the whole Bible. At Sinai, in Exodus 25:8, the instruction is to build a sanctuary so that the Lord may dwell in the midst of his people. That is a tent, then a temple, stone, gold, a mountain in Jerusalem, the most magnificent religious structure in the Jewish world, rebuilt on a scale that made visitors stop in the street. Ezekiel 37:27 carries the promise forward. My dwelling place shall be with them. And then John 1:14 says that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And the Greek verb John chooses is the tent word. He pitched his tent, he tabernacled, tabernacle, temple. And then a fisherman's back room with an earth floor and one lamp and a ceiling of packed mud that 4 determined men could dig through in an afternoon. That is the trajectory. It is not a preacher's flourish. It is the New Testament's own vocabulary. And it means the answer to where God chose to be at home in the 1st century is not the building you would have guessed. It is the one you would have walked past. Which brings me to the last thing I have to tell you, and it is the reason I mentioned a glass floor at the start of this. Capernaum did not last. In the year 749, a catastrophic earthquake tore through the region. The town declined, and by somewhere around the 10th or 11th century, the local sequence is less secure than the earthquake date, so hold that loosely. It was effectively abandoned. The shore stopped mattering. Thorn and dust came over the stones, and for the better part of 1,000 years, nobody came. And then the sequence starts again. 1894, the Franciscans acquire the ground. 1968, Corbo and Lafreda dig under the octagon, and in 1990, a modern memorial church was completed above the excavation. A building raised up on pillars over the ruins with a floor of glass, which means that today you can stand in mid-air above that house. You look straight down through the glass, through the outline of the 5th century octagon, through the 4th century enclosure wall, and onto the black basalt walls of a small 1st century room with an earth floor. People come from every continent to do it. They stand on a transparent floor and look down at a room that would have been dark at noon, in a village of a few hundred to a few thousand people, on the edge of a lake, in a house that belonged, if the tradition is right, to a man who once fell down in a boat and told Jesus to go away from him because he was a sinful man. That is Luke 5:8. The same man, probably that room. A room built before Jesus was born is still, 2,000 years later, the thing that every structure on that site has been arranged around. There is one last line that has to be said, because leaving it out would make this a sentimental story instead of a true one. Capernaum had him, not as a visitor, as a resident. His own city, Matthew called it. The whole town at the door in the evenings. The sick carried up the lane after sundown. Sabbath teaching 30 meters away, years of it. And in Matthew 11:23, speaking of this same town, Jesus says, "And you, Capernaum, will you be exalted to heaven? You shall be brought down to Hades." He borrows the language deliberately from Isaiah 14, where it is aimed at the king of Babylon, and he aims it at a fishing village of 1,000 people that had heard more of him than anyone else alive. Proximity is not the same as response. The village that had him closest was also the village that was warned. Which is, I think, the real reason this small, dark room matters 2,000 years later. Not because we can prove whose it was. We cannot. And I would rather tell you that than pretend otherwise. It matters because of what it says about scale. He did not need the palace down the shore. He needed a doorway, a courtyard, a lamp, and someone willing to let him stay. If this is the kind of history you want, sources named, uncertainty admitted, and the text taken seriously, then subscribe, because this is the only kind we make here, and there is a great deal more of Capernaum still in the ground. And before you go, tell me this. 4 men tore a hole in that roof, and the gospel never says who fixed it. Who do you think it was? Give me your answer below. I want to read them.